senyor Bohdan Nahaylo, al qual agraïm molt la seva gentilesa de ser nosaltres avui aquest vespre. El senyor Bohdan Nahaylo és un periodista britànic, analista polític i autor establert a Barcelona, amb una sòlida trajectòria en els àmbits de drets humans, ajuda humanitària i diplomàcia. Nascut a Anglaterra, d'origen ucranià, va completar els seus estudis a la Gran Bretanya i Nord-Amèrica. A final dels 70 i principis dels 80 va ser responsable dins Amnistia Internacional de la defensa de presoners polítics soviètics. També ha escrit en premsa britànica i americana sobre aquests afers. Més tard va treballar com a especialista per Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. El 1994 va ser convidat a treballar per les Nacions Unides i va arribar a assessor sènior de polítiques per al Comissionat de Refugiats a la Comunitat d'Estats Independents, espai de l'antiga URSS. El seu últim cap de les Nacions Unides va ser l'actual secretari general Antonio Guterres. Mentre treballava a l'Agència de Refugiats, va dirigir operacions a Bielorússia, Azerbaidjan i Angola. Després va deixar l'agència, va liderar el Departament de les Nacions Unides d'Afers Exteriors a Ucraïna, quan el 2014 va esclatar la guerra amb Rússia. A partir que va deixar les Nacions Unides, la seva vida transcorre entre Barcelona i Kíev i es manté molt actiu com a periodista i analista polític. L'acompanyem a la taula l'Abel, president del CGI, i jo mateixa, Rosa Cabús. L'Abel és llicenciat en Ciències Polítiques per la Universitat de Barcelona, màster en Estudis Russos i Eurasiàtics per la Universitat d'Uppsala. El seu àmbit d'especialització se centra en els afers relacionats amb els països de l'antiga Unió Soviètica i incidència internacional. També col·labora habitualment en mitjans catalans. Doncs bé, l'estructura de l'acte us explicaré jo primer el projecte que fem, els objectius i, per últim, us presentaré breument l'equip que el formem. Després ens parlarà l'Abel del nou paradigma global i, en concret, Catalunya i, sobretot, dels errors que es van cometre el 2017 en el camp internacional. Després el seguirà el senyor Nahaylo, el qual ens aportarà el seu anàlisi a l'entorn de Catalunya, Rússia i la Unió Europea. I en acabar obrirem un torn de preguntes pels qui vulgueu preguntar. Doncs bé, com alguns ja sabeu, el Catalonia Global Institute neix per ser un espai d'anàlisi, un espai d'interpretació de l'escenari internacional actual, però fer-ho sobretot des d'una perspectiva nacionalment autocentrada. És una eina pels agents públics i privats orientada a la internacionalització de Catalunya en clau, visió i aspiracions d'estat, és a dir, és per estar a la disposició de les agències públiques catalanes, agents econòmics i, en general, per tot el teixit social. Amb quin objecte? El que volem fer és identificar les oportunitats polítiques, econòmiques i geoestratègiques dins el taulell mundial. Nosaltres partim d'una visió realista, com ja haureu vist al nostre web, i creativa, ja que incorpora el món de la cultura, de l'economia, la seguretat i també el rol de la diàspora catalana. Treballem per una Catalunya que aspira a la plena sobirania i que parli el llenguatge del sistema d'estats. En concret, i com a línies de recerca, tenim, en primer lloc, la monitorització de l'aparició de Catalunya en els mitjans internacionals amb més influència sobre les elits que decideixen. En segon lloc, fem un seguiment especial dels esdeveniments que es desenvolupen a la Mediterrània com a espai geopolític natural de Catalunya. I, en tercer lloc, fem un estudi també de les dinàmiques de fons tant de tipus geopolític, econòmic i demogràfic, identificant les oportunitats i riscos per Catalunya que se'n deriven d'aquestes. Ens estructurem en forma d'associació i funcionem a través de donacions privades i d'autofinançament. La nostra eina més visible en aquest moment, com haureu vist, és el nostre web, on ja tenim alguns dels primers articles i informes i on treballem les línies de recerca ja esmentades. Donem també un servei de consultoria en àrees específiques de negoci i d'àrees d'internacionalització i ben aviat esperem també podem oferir en l'àmbit de la formació tallers i seminaris també per aportar i donar aquestes eines d'anàlisi i interpretació als que participin. I per últim, no voldria deixar de presentar-vos breument l'equip que el formem i que està format per un equip de gent jove i que estan repartits per tot el món. L'encapçala, com ja he dit, l'Abel, president del CGI, i que és politòleg especialitzat en l'espai postsoviètic. El nostre director en cap és en Bohdan, politòleg i jurista. Ara mateix està a Brussel·les. En Jofre Rocabert, doctor en Ciències Polítiques, és el director de Cercle. També radicat a Suïssa, però que avui tenim el plaer de tenir nosaltres aquí a la sala. En Miquel Vila, director executiu, politòleg especialitzat en l'Àsia Oriental, que segurament ens està seguint des de Nova York. En Roger Castellanos, doctor en Filosofia, és el nostre director d'iniciatives estratègiques, també amb nosaltres aquí a la sala avui. En Víctor Puig, consultor i analista, és el director de Relacions Externes. No et veig, però també per aquí. I per últim, la Saia Guidó, que és politòloga i sociòloga i que també ens està seguint des del País Valencià. I per últim, jo mateixa, graduada en Estudis de la Guerra i Filosofia. I dit això, doncs passo la paraula a l'Abel.
Creixent confrontació, simplement, i intentaré ser bastant breu, unes reflexions sobre els perquès d'això. Perquè una sèrie de gent ens decidim a arribar a la conclusió que un espai o una iniciativa com aquesta és necessària i perquè decidim d'alguna manera tirar-ho endavant i impulsar-ho. I sent bastant honest i transparent des del principi, el fet és que tot això d'entrada i d'origen sorgeix d'una frustració compartida i d'un cert desencís en relació a com s'han fet les coses a nivell de país i especialment a nivell de projecte polític sobiranista o independentista, més específicament, pel que fa a l'escena internacional, pel que fa a la internacionalització del conflicte, pel que fa a l'acció exterior del moviment i especialment de les seves institucions. I sobretot en allò que van ser els esdeveniments de l'any 2017. Bé, el 8 persones que impulsem aquest projecte, especialment amb alguns més catres, però la majoria evidentment ja ens coneixien de feia temps i hem tingut hores i hores i hores de converses, inclús algun podcast dels que tenia el Víctor de l'avió Lisboa sobre la qüestió internacional, donar-li moltes voltes al cap sobre què es devien aquests errors i sobretot maneres i idees sobre com començar o almenys, si més no, posar una aportació, poder crear algun tipus d'espai o plataforma per posar un granet de sorra per contribuir a un canvi de paradigma pel que fa com des de Catalunya i com des del moviment sobiranista s'entén l'acció internacional i s'entén la internacionalització del propi conflicte. En essència, i primer de tot, aquí hi ha una qüestió segurament de manca. És un tema que a poc, almenys alguns sectors el comencen a superar, a millorar la comprensió en relació a aquesta qüestió, però en origen, especialment en l'època pre-2017, hi havia evidentment una interpretació que nosaltres considerava errònia del que són les relacions internacionals en tant que des d'aquí es percebia, es projectava unes relacions internacionals basades en valors i principis més enllà i per damunt del que poden ser els interessos, que al final és allò que determina les decisions i els moviments i les prioritats dels actors internacionals i primer de tot, i per damunt de tot, dels estats, que són els elements encara a dia d'avui, tot i la globalització, tot i el sorgiment de nous actors transnacionals, organismes internacionals, etc., els estats segueixen sent l'element nuclear fonamental i les relacions entre els estats són allò que determinen quin tipus d'ordre global hi ha a cada moment de la història i especialment les relacions de poder entre aquests estats. Llavors, entenem que es va pecar i en gran mesura segueix pecant d'una visió fins a cert punt naïf i molt regionalitzada que són les relacions internacionals, i en base a aquesta diagnosi, al final, la nostra aportació i la nostra motivació, també des del punt de vista del compromís cívic o si es pot dir del patriotisme, és única i exclusivament d'oferir unes noves ulleres, de proposar una nova manera que de fet no és tan nova, de fet sempre hi ha sigut, però d'alguna manera, en tant que Catalunya no té tradició d'estat des de fa segles, doncs malauradament és una visió que ha quedat, que aquí, durant els darrers anys i dècades, ha quedat bastant lluny. Bàsicament és aportar una perspectiva realista i amb una vessant geopolítica a les relacions internacionals, a el que és el debat públic a Catalunya i el debat de les idees, especialment per allò que fa referència al projecte d'una Catalunya que vol esdevenir un estat independent i que és una realitat d'un fet que s'ha anat validant a través de majories que cada cop són més consolidades i cada cop són més àmplies durant els darrers anys. Llavors entenem que aquesta vessant internacional és un element fonamental que s'ha de treballar de forma més realista, precisament centrant-se sobretot en el que són els interessos dels estats. Unes ulleres també per, efectivament, posar el nostre net de sobre per recuperar aquesta credibilitat perduda durant les setmanes de la tardor del 2017, on es van donar unes diferències bastant greus entre fets i paraules, entre paraules i fets, sense potser no tenir massa consciència o una consciència del tot afinada de com s'interpretaven a l'exterior, a nivell internacional, els fets i allò que estava ocorrent a Catalunya. Precisament per no tenir aquesta visió realista, doncs potser aquí no vam ser del tot conscients que hi havia molts governs del món que d'alguna manera percebien que alguna cosa molt grossa estava passant al cor de la Unió Europea o un dels països més importants de la Unió Europea, que és que un estat membre estava perdent el control d'una part del seu territori. De fet, aquells dies, uns dies abans i l'1 d'octubre, uns dies després, es pot dir que l'estat espanyol no controlava del tot i d'alguna manera el mite aquest de la violència, del monopoli de la violència legítima, que suposa que és l'element fonamental dels estats, feia aigües per tot arreu de Catalunya. No sé fins a quin punt aquí en vam ser conscients d'això i del que això implicava, especialment pel que fa a l'1 d'octubre, un dia en què a Catalunya es va començar una cosa tan bèstia com un referèndum d'independència per trencar l'estat, és a dir, i l'estat va ser incapaç d'impedir-ho. Clar, això des del punt de vista del poder, que al final és l'essència de la política, és molt important, és històric i és una demostració efectivament de poder envers un poder que fa fallida i els estats, els governs que pensen en aquesta clau segurament ho van veure així, a diferència possiblement de com es va veure des d'aquí, que es va veure amb unes altres claus. Insisteixo, aquestes ulleres també que volem aportar de forma humil i simplement amb vocació de servei a la causa és també, evidentment, analitzar quins són els interessos fonamentals dels diferents estats de la comunitat internacional. Aquí, evidentment, podem identificar diferents categories d'interessos, però hi ha una cosa que són els interessos fonamentals, que normalment estan relacionats amb qüestions de seguretat o qüestions econòmiques. I és aquí on és important veure quines són, primer de les capacitats pròpies de Catalunya i en base a això què pot oferir Catalunya en relació als interessos dels diferents estats de la comunitat internacional, especialment alguns que poden tenir d'entrar un interès major pel tipus de relació que tingui amb l'estat espanyol, pel tipus de relació que tingui amb la Unió Europea, amb l'OTAN, etc. Aquest és un exercici molt necessari que nosaltres entenem que, malauradament, no s'ha fet, o no s'ha fet de la forma sistematitzada que s'hauria de fer. I en base a això, des de les institucions, prendre les decisions més adequades a cada moment. Volem abordar les lleis també per generar consciència en relació a la importància de la retroalimentació entre el que passa dins del país i l'acció d'internacionalització que es pugui fer a l'exterior. I és que, de fet, els principals actius per a la internacionalització de la causa són precisament els fets consumats, la determinació i la disposició a assumir els costos necessaris com a col·lectiu, que això és precisament el que va passar a l'octubre, per així en els objectius d'alliberament nacional. En altres paraules, l'acció d'internacionalització primera i més important és aquella que es fa al propi territori. I en aquest sentit, insisteixo, és important tenir autoconsciència sobre com es va interpretar l'octubre a l'exterior. De forma més general, i fent referència al paradigma de relacions internacionals global que tenim ara mateix, és evident que el real polític mai ha marxat, però també és evident que ara és més present que mai, i ara, el 2021, és més present que el 2017 inclús. Hi ha un enduriment progressiu i cada cop més ràpid de les relacions internacionals. Hi ha una acceleració dels canvis cap a un paradigma multipolar que va més enllà inclús d'un canvi en l'estructura del poder global com el que va haver-hi amb la fi de la Guerra Freda i amb la fi del paradigma bipolar. I és que ara mateix aquest canvi en les relacions internacionals, aquest canvi en el paradigma multipolar, comporta que el centre més important del poder global s'estigui desplaçant des de l'Occident cap a l'Àsia, i de fet això és una novetat en els darrers 500 anys d'història. I és important tenir-ho molt present i ser conscients també com a territori petit que som a la Mediterrània occidental. En aquest sentit, el paradigma post-Guerra Freda, que heredava també elements de l'ordre que es va crear després de la Segona Guerra Mundial, a poc es va esvaint. Parlem d'un món cada cop més interdependent, però a la vegada amb uns nivells de compatibilitat creixents a nivell polític, a nivell econòmic i a nivell militar. Vivim en un temps en el que s'estan dibuixant cada setmana que passa les noves regles del joc global, amb una competició creixent per determinar com s'establiran aquestes noves interdependències i quines són les relacions de poder que se'n derivin d'aquestes. En aquest sentit, destaca la iniciativa, entre altres, però aquesta segurament és la més representativa i una de les que té més possibilitats de reeixir, de la franja i la ruta, que és coneguda com el Belt and Road, l'instrument per a la configuració de fet, entre altres coses, i sobretot un nou ordre global on la Xina se situï al centre de les diferents jerarquies que es van establir. Parlem també d'un ordre global on hi ha una competència i una rivalitat creixent entre els tres principals poders militars, com són la Xina, els Estats Units i Rússia. Parlem també, però, d'un procés i d'un nou ordre global on potències regionals com la Índia, Turquia, el Regne Unit o Japó tenen un paper cada cop més assertiu, i un fet que ho demostra, entre altres, és l'increment exponencial dels seus pressupostos en defensa i la seva creixent activitat militar en les regions d'influència respectives. O, sense anar més lluny, on la mateixa Unió Europea parla cada cop més de desenvolupar una autonomia estratègica i de jugar un paper geopolític més independent, més autònom dels Estats Units i dels interessos dels Estats Units. En aquest sentit, una de les nostres aspiracions és analitzar com s'estan desenvolupant aquests canvis, especialment a la Mediterrània, tot i que no només, on, sense anar més lluny, hi ha conflictes i hostilitats històriques, però que d'alguna manera estan guanyant força com les enfronten a Grècia i a Turquia. En aquest context, i ja per acabar, considerem, i vam tenir en compte aquests canvis que estan produint, nosaltres considerem el CGI com a plataforma d'observació, de generació d'idees i de propostes, identificació de riscos i d'oportunitats, especialment pel que fa a la vessant de Catalunya com a potencial estat, des d'una perspectiva realista. I aquí un exemple bastant paradigmàtic, però que realment demostra fins a quin punt. Molt sovint els debats els intercanvis d'idees o informació a nivell polític i mediàtic en aquest país estan allunyats del que són aquests canvis o estan apartats o desconeixen aquests canvis que estan produint. És que fa un mes es va organitzar la conferència sobre data únic, que és la trobada més important arreu del món en temes de seguretat, en temes militars, en temes de conflictes. Ja no és que Catalunya no hi fos present, és que el debat o la informació o el seguiment des de Catalunya sobre aquest esdeveniment anual on es reuneixen, en aquest cas de forma telemàtica, els principals líders del món per debatre, per discutir, per intercanviar idees, i moltes vegades de forma bastant hostil, en relació a temes relacionats amb defensa i amb conflictes arreu del món, aquí no es va fer cap tipus de seguiment, d'esment, i és una de les qüestions que entenem, entre moltes altres, que demostra fins a quin punt cal reconnectar Catalunya amb aquests debats també a nivell global. Ja acabant, una de les nostres aspiracions també és, en aquest sentit, promoure la construcció d'una massa social crítica en l'àmbit de les relacions internacionals a Catalunya amb visió d'estat, i sobretot de promoure l'accountability i la rendició de comptes, especialment pel que fa a organismes i institucions catalanes en competències d'afers exteriors, entre les quals destaca la Conselleria d'Exteriors del Govern de la Generalitat, el paper del qual entenem que podria anar molt més enllà d'allò que s'ha estat fent almenys els darrers 2 o 3 anys, especialment pel que fa al potencial pendent de desenvolupar d'internacionalització del conflicte en totes les seves dimensions. Bé, acabada aquesta breu reflexió, és evident que un dels temes més d'actualitat dins d'aquest nou paradigma global que està configurant és el paper que juga Rússia en l'actualitat. And so allow me now to turn to English language as we now will move to the next part of the session. We'll be discussing with Mr. Nahaylo the role of Russia and its potential impact on Catalonia. Thank you again for being with us, Mr. Nahaylo. Let me start with a brief question. During the last years, Russia has been one of the most active and dynamic actors at the international stage, in several parts of the world actually. And one could even talk about a case of diplomatic hyperactivity, often punching above its weight. In this regard, there's much debate over its current real status as a power. Considering this, how would you assess Russia's role? Can we talk about a re-emerging power, or is it actually a declining power struggling to hide this reality?
Okay, Abel. Thank you very much for the invitation to take the mask off. Diplomats don't take masks off. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak. Thank you for your kindness in agreeing to listen to me in English, not Catalan. And first of all, congratulations to the creators of this new Catalan Global Institute. I think it's a very worthwhile, timely initiative. The world needs to understand you and know you better, and you probably can also profit from understanding why certain things happen or don't happen in the case of Catalonia or other parts of the world. Allow me to just digress for a second before I answer or try to respond to your question. A few words about myself and just about how I intend to talk today. I don't want this to be a dry presentation of any sort. I would rather throw out some ideas to stimulate thought, encourage insights, etc. Let me start off by saying that, as you've heard, I'm British of Ukrainian origin, and let me say that Ukraine and Catalonia have a lot in common. Let's say we had over the centuries a certain power next door, or two, who imposed their not only political rule, but their cultural, hegemony on us and essentially wanted us to appear as if we were the same as them. I'm talking about, in particular, Russia. And we also had that problem that very few people knew about us for a long time, because the great achievements of Russian culture, and they are indeed impressive, many of them were made by non-Russians acting in the imperial mold. Let's take the Ukrainian writer Bohdan in Ukraine, or many others, whether they be Belarusians or Georgians or Armenians or whatever. But empires claim the best and try to take the credit for it. And of course they are not happy when empires unravel and the truth begins to come out, or shall we say different interpretations. Anyway, growing up in England, for instance, language was important, and I respect very much the fact that in Catalonia language is so important to you. I went to a Saturday school every Saturday for 10 years, where I learned Ukrainian, not Russian, though I know Russian, and where I was taught the culture and the history of my parents and of the land that they were from. And I empathize very much with the Catalans when I think of all the numerous Catalans that were refugees, the survivors who had to live in neighboring countries or far. And one person who made a profound impact on me as a young man when I was interested in culture and music was Abel. His Song of the Birds I used to listen to very frequently because I was very moved by his appearance at the United Nations when he spoke about his dream for Catalonia. And you know, it rang a bell in me and in my Ukrainian colleagues too. Which is not to say that that made me anti-Russian. It made me certainly anti-Soviet, because I was dealing with political prisoners, and not just Ukrainians, Jews, Lithuanians, Armenians, Georgians, Russian Democrats, and there were quite a few at that time active. Let's remember the great Sakharov and his Cercle, who did so much to make information about human rights abuses known to the outside world. But, of course, things changed. As the Bob Dylan song said, the times have changed. And many of us had this hope that Russia would indeed go a different way after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But before I get to that, one other example, George Orwell. Now you will yawn and say, oh, typical Brit, he's going to talk about homage to Catalonia, and as if that's the only thing that they know about. Now let me tell you, give you an example about George Orwell, who was here in 1937, yeah? And when Russia, in the form of the Soviet Union, was very active in this area. And George Orwell was, shall we say, very interested to know who the Soviet consul was at that time. Why was he so brutal? Why was he suppressing the leftists and the anarchists who were not pro-Moscow? And he discovered, as I discovered researching him, that he was a Ukrainian. He was a Ukrainian Bolshevik who in 1918 had helped establish Soviet rule in Ukraine, very bloodily, incidentally, Antonov Ovsienko. And this got Orwell interested in who are these Ukrainians. And then he found out about the famine, the artificial famine of 1933, where an estimated 4 to 7 million, we don't know, people were starved to death. And this encouraged him later to write Animal Farm, which is based on that, before he wrote 1984. So here there is also a connection. For me, growing up in Britain, you see, Barcelona, it symbolized freedom in the sense of that struggle for freedom in the 30s, but in another way that it encouraged Orwell to move beyond his, perhaps, naive leftist views at that time, as he discovered, given the Soviet reality, and to think further and to create 1984 and to move beyond. And that is a lesson for us, because as we know, Russia in its present form is also interested in what's happening in Catalonia. We've heard from the Madrid authorities accusations of serious meddling. Whether true or not, I'm not somebody that can comment, but anyway, that factor has been raised. And as we know, very recently, when the EU foreign impresario, external affairs impresario, was in Moscow, Lavrov reminded him, who are you to lecture us about human rights when you're imprisoning Spanish politicians in democratic EU, etc. So that connection somehow remains behind the scenes, and I just wanted to emphasize that on a personal note. Now, what do I think? To be honest, I think without going into the formalities and using all the proper terminology that one uses when examining international relations, let's cut to the core, as they say, because time is limited. I think Russia had a great opportunity to move closer to the West and integrate even with the rest of Europe in the early 90s. And I think if we simplify things, we can see that there are at least three dominant schools within approaches to Russian foreign policy. At that time, it was the Atlanticists, those who wanted a sort of pro-Western course. Kozyrev was the foreign minister, Yeltsin was the president. And in fact, my first mission to Russia was in 1994. Imagine a UN mission in the North Caucasus before the war in Chechnya, invited by the Russian government to look at ethnic cleansing claims from the Ingush at the hands of the North Ossetians. And then the war broke out the following year in 95, and I was there leading the delegation, the first UN delegation to Dagestan on the other side of Chechnya. So in those days it seemed possible that this kind of cooperation would work, and that indeed there would be not only dialogue, but practical cooperation even in sensitive spheres like human rights and nationalities policy. Now, my specialization in Britain was nationalities policy. You know, I wasn't a specialist on the Soviet economy, and I didn't study the careers of first-party secretaries, as many of my fellow colleagues did, but I was interested in to what extent is the Soviet Union still an empire? Will it hold? And where are the problems? Where are the fault lines? And if any of you are interested, I wrote a book in 1990 called Soviet Disunion. It was a bestseller. It came out in London and in New York, but there was a Japanese edition, which got me my job at the UN, because the High Commissioner for Refugees was a woman called Sadako Ogata, and she had read my book in Japanese, and she said, Dr. Nahaylo, well, I wasn't a doctor, but she called me a doctor, because I almost finished my PhD at the LSE, but instead went to the Amnesty to work there, and she said, we need what we would call today GPS, a GPS system, because who are the Chechens, who are the Ingush, who are the Abkhaz, who are the Ukrainians? Are they different from the Russians, the Lithuanians, and the Belarusians, and others? And that's how, thanks to that book, I got there. But I've always been interested in the nationalities question, which is a euphemism for how nations trying to end empires, to extricate themselves from empires, behave, act, etc. And let me remind you that in those early 90s, when the Soviet Union was falling apart, and already in July 1990 on CNN Live, I predicted that the Soviet Union would collapse. You can see it on YouTube. There was a long interview, there was a party conference going on in Moscow. Ligachev was attacking Gorbachev, but they had just imposed a moratorium on Lithuania from breaking away. And they said, well, Mr. Nahaylo, what do you think? Will the Soviet Union retain Lithuania? I said it's game over, especially now that Ukraine, the largest of the groups, has moved and created a movement for independence. And that was in 1990. But all of that is very important. but I want to emphasize that even in those days, when we had crusading anti-communists wanting the Soviet Union to collapse, theoretically, George Bush came to, President Bush Sr. came to Kiev and said, don't rush things, support Gorbachev, he's offering you a new treaty, things will be better, stick together, etc. And the Iron Lady, Mrs. Thatcher, my own Prime Minister, said the same thing. People were afraid, of course, that this giant conglomerate of nations were falling apart. They were worried about the nuclear arms and armies, etc. But they tended to see the more dangerous negative side rather than the positive side. Okay, here we are 30 years later, talking about these things. Now, I mentioned that there were these prevalent currents, and the Atlanticist current basically lost out to two others that united. One was the imperialist one, and the other is the pan-Slavic one. By the imperialists, I mean, in a very crude way, the desire to restore Russia's greatness, not calling it the Soviet Union, but re-establish Russia where possible within old boundaries, but certainly to impose a hegemony which was not just political and not just economic, but cultural. Hence the notion of the Russian world. The Russian speakers, we have a right to defend them. Ruski mir, right? Which we see now in the Donbass, Crimea, Belarus, etc., etc. Russia feels it has this right, even moral right, to defend those that speak the same language, or are of a similar religion. Now, this had understandable elements because Russia felt threatened by the EU expanding eastward, by NATO expanding eastward. But we always hear this sympathetic, this line of sympathy. Moscow's very worried, the aggressive West or NATO is expanding. 13 new countries, most of them formerly from the Soviet bloc, communist bloc, joined NATO, and most the EU. Now why? They were forced to join, they wanted to join. Of course there were economic incentives, but at the end of the day, for Eastern Europeans and Central Europeans, there was this idea of shared values of a European family that they wanted to rejoin, having been kidnapped, as they felt, as Ukrainians felt, as Belarusians now are affirming. Certainly the Poles did a long time ago, the Poles, etc. So it was a difficult situation for Russia to manage, and I think that under Putin, he mismanaged the situation. Let me remind you, 20 years ago, Vladimir Putin was talking about a pan-Europe spreading from, Calais to Vladivostok. He was talking about Russia joining NATO. Do any of you remember that? And then, after a few years, this changed. And the emphasis, driven by internal concerns, Chechnya, the need to keep Russia together, by growing economic might, the feeling that there is this wealth from oil and gas all of a sudden that can be tapped, and that can make Russia indeed into a superpower again, which led to that joke, with a lot of truth, that Russia became a superpower because it's a huge petrol station with nuclear arms. Remember that people were talking about this 10, 15 years ago. Well, since then, obviously, due to some of its actions, in particular, I would say 2014, I'm not even talking about domestically, the shape that Russia took, the type of lack of government, shall we say, the centralized authoritarian model that was instituted and based on a kind of crude patriotism, initially crushing the Chechens, keeping the North Caucasus in order, but then taking back Crimea as it was presented, helping as it was presented the Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine, etc. This one initially brownie points for Putin, but in the longer term, it created huge problems. Sanctions from the West, ostracization, and damaging after effects. In short, not only did Russia lose much of the goodwill or neutrality that was being shown by the West, by Europe, it lost, for example, Ukraine. So who cares, you might say. But think of Ukraine not just as a territory, but as a huge market. Remember the billions that Russia was earning from selling gas at astronomical prices to Ukraine and making that country absolutely energy dependent on it. Certainly, since the war ended, since 2015, Ukraine is buying next to no gas or oil from Russia. And it took Russia's Gazprom to court, and you may not have noticed, but at the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020, it won an international arbitration, the biggest arbitration case of its sort in history, where Russia immediately had to pay back the equivalent of about 29 billion and 5 or 6 of it in cash, and agree to a transit contract to Europe for another 5 years, which they had wanted to end. That problem with the loss of markets doesn't just, end with Ukraine. Right now, the completion of the Nord Stream 2 is in doubt. The Americans are putting up on the pressure again, though Biden seems to be, shall we say, biding his time, pardon the repetition there. And at the same time, oil prices fell, as we saw in recent years, and Russia is not in the same, shall we say, economic strong position as it was. Secondly, that loss of faith in the emperor is growing. Not just the Navalny case, but there's a general discouragement that the rich got richer, the poor got poorer, the money is drying up, and now there's the pandemic, and it's being badly managed, not just in Russia, I know, but it is a huge problem. And suddenly, Russia has become even more isolated, even more paranoid about what others think about it, but even more aggressive in recent years in striking out and doing the sorts of things that it was doing a little bit more subtly, if at all, say 5, 10, 15 years ago. Interfering in elections, cyber attacks, sending its warplanes to probe the frontiers as far away as Australia, etc. Yes, a flexing of muscles. But is that a sign of strength or a sign of fear, weakness, insecurity? In 2016 or so, when Putin clearly hoped that a victory by Trump would create a more auspicious environment after the sanctions that were imposed in 14 and 15 after Crimea, etc., and the Donbass, he felt confident enough to become involved in Syria, to attempt a coup or an assassination, a change of power in Montenegro, for example. We forget about such things as this. But we have a Biden victory, and at the end of the day, what do we see? We see severe, I would say, reversals in a broad range of areas or potential reversals, where Russia is insecure. Let's start with Nahaylo quickly. Yes, there's a Russian peacekeeping force there in place, but the Turks have become the main factor in that particular area. And Armenia has lost the territories that it occupied, I was there. I was the UNHCR representative in Baku, but I was in Armenia too. 17% or 19 almost percent of Azerbaijan's territory was held by Armenia as a buffer zone. I'm not talking about Nagorno-Karabakh itself. So that's one thing. The elections in the unrest in the elections in Armenia, not a thing, still manageable for Russia, but not the way that Russia wanted it to go. Moldova, a pro-European candidate elected recently, at the end of the year, beginning of this year, right? As I say, Ukraine more or less lost, looking westward. Latest figures say, I think it's over 60% want to join NATO, which has risen dramatically in 10 years or so. And a president that was seen as a lightweight by Moscow initially compared to Poroshenko, who's suddenly standing firm, is closing down pro-Russian channels, and those that are, accused of simply spewing out Russian propaganda. And last but not least, a very big headache, Belarus. Nobody expected, as they say in Monty Python, the Spanish Inquisition. And suddenly, Belarus moved. And since August, there's been this very heroic struggle for democracy and for genuine elections and for self-determination, in effect. That is a huge headache, because Lukashenko is by no means a friend in real terms of Putin, but Putin has to put up with him. Lukashenko is a drain on him, economically, financially, but he's also a bulwark against the West coming in by pro-Western forces taking over. So, unresolved situation there. So at the moment, China is the best bet Russia has, though that's an uncomfortable partnership. China's economy dwarfs that of Russia. Russia has the missiles, China has missiles too. They've just agreed basically on a strategic alliance, as we've seen, which extends even into the space area after 20 years or so of cooperation with the Americans. Moscow is now going with China. And if you want, what we're seeing is, instead of progress in the Western sector, suddenly Russia is being forced to look eastward, and for good reasons too. Markets, booming economies, India as a factor there, not just China, etc. But at the end of the day, to finish off here, it is certainly declining in terms of the potential that it had 10 years ago and the potential it could have realized. It has mismanaged things economically, politically. It has alienated itself even from those who, by and large, were, shall we say, played it both ways. And the Germans in particular, the French, after Nahaylo, it's difficult to justify being, shall we say, so happy to see Mr. Putin at a meeting, right? So the EU, we will discuss again, the EU is telling Moscow that relations are at an all-time low. So in that sense, it has lost, but it still remains a formidable force, and it cannot be dismissed as not being a factor that will remain a strong player on the international scene for the next 5, 7, 10 years, who knows. But will it be able to adjust somehow and play a constructive role, or will it remain a nuisance factor and a threat? The perception of Putin and Russia is where he has lost out. 10, 15 years ago, he had a lot more credit going for him than he does now, both at home and especially abroad. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, for a very insightful question. You basically went through the history of Soviet Union and Russia for the last 40 years, so I guess you are done, because you answered right now. It was indeed very interesting, insightful points. We probably agree on some of them, we might disagree on others. Definitely, we do agree on the importance, strategic importance of Ukraine for Russia, and how the loss of Ukraine from the Kremlin has been perceived probably as the biggest geostrategic loss of post-Soviet Russia in the last 30 years. Not only economically, not only politically, but the symbolic, cultural, historical importance that Ukraine has for Russia, especially for the political leadership in Russia. As a birthplace.
I would say that as a historian also, Ukraine in the late 20th, 21st century became the Poland of the 19th century. For the Russian Empire, Poland, it was important not to lose Poland. There were insurrections there. Remember, the Polish movement was very strong. But they anchored themselves and returned to Europe. And now Ukraine and Belarus increasingly, let's not forget Belarus, because attention has been focused on Ukraine, but it will be very critical, I think, to see how things develop in the next months there too.
Absolutely, precisely linking it with ongoing events in Belarus, White Russia, and connecting it with what happened in Ukraine in 2013-14, Mala Rosa, small Russia, like a continuation, these two countries of the greater Russia, or at least how the Kremlin or the leadership, political leadership in Russia perceives itself as well, and perceives these two countries as a continuation of itself. Especially in the case of Ukraine, the birthplace, let's say, of Russianness, of Kievsky Rus, or this mention to Kiev, Marka of Ruskich, as they call it, Kiev, the mother of all Russian cities, or the place where all the Russian history started. So for Russia, obviously, it was a great, geopolitically, but also symbolically, a great loss. They saved Crimea, that's the minor prize here. So we definitely agree on this.
Can I just add something there? You see, this is again from the point of view of Kyiv today, not Kiev. It was never the mother of Russian cities. The state in medieval times is called Rus, R-U-S. Nobody knows where that word comes from, probably from the Vikings who were traveling up and down the Dnieper. It was Peter the Great, after defeating Charles XII of Sweden and Mazepa, the Ukrainian leader who joined him at the last minute in 1709 power, that changed the name of Muscovy, Moscovia, to that of Russia. And he called himself the Tsar of all the Ruses, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, which was Kievska Rus, because that was the center, was there, and Velika Rus, Great Russia, as they decided to call themselves. So he became the Tsar of Great Russia, Little Russia, and White Russia, which, and because of the translation in the 19th century, and that the empire was called Russia, everybody was called Russians. Malorossi is not Malorossiane in Russian. There's a semantic difference there, those of you who know English. So it's something that we've had to deal with, and something that Russia has gained from. But Kiev and the Rus, in the first mention of Moscow, was I think in 1143 as a village. Their first settlement, major stronghold, was Vladimir Suzdal. Well, Kiev and the Rus was in its heyday in the early 11th century, Yaroslav the Wise, etc. So it's like saying, Americans saying, Washington is the, London is, but how can I put it? But they are somehow responsible also for Magna Carta, running green, and all of this. Different processes. Ukraine remained under Western influence until the 18th century, because it was absorbed by the Duchy of Lithuania and Poland. Okay, sorry. This is the diplomat, not wearing his mask. And really, we didn't have a connection with that Asiatic part of the empire that didn't regard itself as Europe. You remember Peter the Great went and was westernizing Muscovy and shaving off beards. Well, we had a university in Kiev, the Miller Academy, where they were teaching in Latin, which was a no-no for Orthodox because it was supposed to be in Greek only, but they were teaching in Polish. And who closed it down? So, but then, I'm speaking like a Catalan.
So, yeah, definitely very interesting points again. Let's from now on try to stick to the questions wherever possible. I know that every point would allow for discussion, even much more time discussing it. But let's talk more specifically about prospects for relations between Russia and, on one hand, the US. On the other hand, the European Union. We've seen a progressive deterioration of relationships during the last year, especially last couple of years. Cross-oppositions, new sanctions against Russian officials, very recently related to the case of Alexei Navalny, cyber attacks, very serious cyber attacks. Russia wanted this case late 2020. There was a retaliation, most likely by the US a few weeks ago. Where do you see all this heading? And more specifically, when it comes to the cyber attacks, do you see any possibility for a broader conflict abroad, especially when it comes here to the US and Russia, within the next 2, 3 years, 4 years, within the Biden administration, considering that for the Biden administration there is a very specific approach, very straightforward and even hostile approach to the Russian Federation?
Well, you remember President Reagan called the Soviet Union the evil empire, and Biden has dared to nod and say yes, he does consider Putin to be a killer. So kind of déjà vu, déjà entendu. I think that Moscow is taken aback by it was taken aback by the fact that Biden lost, and that the rules of the game changed again, and that Biden, though not as hawkish as perhaps was expected, he did go and renew the arms control treaty. He has not said personally whether they will really insist on Germany stopping Nord Stream 2, though they would like them to stop it, etc. So I think that the danger is that Russia is closing in on itself, both domestically and in terms of the paranoia of seeing a more, shall we say, aggressive stance. By aggressive, I think what it fears most is that it had a certain success in dividing the West within the EU, within NATO, setting off debates, creating narratives that undermined and did not provide cohesion. And then suddenly you have a president who's saying, look, we're back and we want to be we want to resume our role. Let's negotiate the role, whether it will be as it was before or slightly different. But anyway, we will pull our weight. We want you to pull your weight more, etc. And of course, this undoes the work that Russia has been doing to weaken these institutions. And also Biden's, I think, approach to the Americans. He's obviously he's not going to win back the diehard Trump supporters. But he's coming across as quite reasonable, wanting to unite the population. I will be the president of all Americans, not just those who voted for me. This sort of message, which goes against the divisive line. Now, to just one final point on that, I think from what I read, and perhaps you suspect also, is now that the Chinese and the Russians have got together and are flaunting their new rapprochement and embracing each other as strategic partners, there could be cooperation there in terms of the hacking and the cyber attacks, because not all of them are identified as coming from Russia. Quite a few are supposedly coming from China too. So, you know, in the longer term, I think that is more worrying than perhaps what we've seen before, but we'll see.
Yeah, definitely going to be one of the issues, one of the topics to be following very closely during the next 2-3 years, especially also because it, as we mentioned before, it also has an impact on the relation between Russia and China, and as such, it has an impact on the forming of the use of this new global multipolar model, in which the relation between Russia and China, as well as far as it is to a great extent influenced by the relation on one side between US and Russia and on the other between US and China. It's, you know, and then we have the European Union saying, okay, what's my role here? Talking about atomic strategy, talking about geopolitical EU, certainly not really finding its place within this clear competition between these two countries.
But one thing I think that is happening is that, you know, Russia wanted, if possible, a bipolar world, but probably realized that it didn't have the clout anymore, so a multipolar world. But increasingly, 10 years down the road, or 15 years down the road, we may see a bipolar world with China being the other player and America, maybe a declining America, but with Russia under the wing of China out of necessity. You know, I mean, I'm looking forward. China has, you know, continued its policy of infiltration, economic, quite skillfully throughout many countries where we least expected. Yeah, if there was to be an alliance which was more than just a declaratory one and cooperation, Russia could gain from this, because it doesn't really. I mean, yes, it can put on a show in Syria. But as the Americans showed, they can also, you know, in one action take out some of the best Wagner fighters who were there, you know, and bruise them. So I think we're in a situation where there's a reconfiguration taking place. The other reconfiguration, let's remember, I'm sorry that I didn't mention, is obviously within Europe. Brexit has happened. Britain has left, signed a strategic partnership relationship with Ukraine all of a sudden last year. The SAS, they've announced, is going to be conducting covert operations to spy on Russian forces in other countries where they suspect they are up to no good. Right? This was just declared this week. But in Eastern Europe and Eastern and Central Europe, I think part of this reconfiguration is that there's a feeling, despite the problems of Hungary and Poland and their politics and their ideas of governance, there is a kind of, shall we say, frustration with the Berlin Paris axis, you know, dictating to us. 2 weeks ago, when was it? At the beginning of, until February, as you know, France was against the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which will bring gas along the Baltic to Germany, right? And then after a talk that Merkel had with Macron on the 4th or 5th of February, he announced that France would now support it. But there was a very interesting statement he made. He said, this issue is up to Berlin and Paris to decide, like, butt out everybody else, Americans or the rest of Europe, because many European countries, not just the eastern ones, were against it. And I think that there is this idea that there's a certain arrogance that has come across with undercurrents of business self-interest rather than values, democratic values, European common values being promoted. And there is a reaction in Eastern Europe to this. I mean, look at the lack of reaction to Belarus, for example. It's as if it's off the radar screen. Navalny is more important. Navalny is important, but you've got a whole country where there are now, several hundred political prisoners and 3,000 or 4,000 people who have been gone through the courts. It should be an issue of concern. I'm well aware of similar analogies on a smaller scale here in Catalonia too. So we have what we have, but there is this reconfiguration taking place at various levels, I would say.
Yes, indeed. You actually mentioned several very interesting and tempting topics to keep on discussing, but I'm afraid we need to move on. We have still a couple of questions before we move to questions and answers.
People are not falling asleep yet, no? I can't see the masks there.
That's good. So let's now move to the kind of dimension on all these issues, or at least part of them. You mentioned before this meeting failed to a certain extent, and the press conference that followed between Mr. Borrell and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on the place on February 5th, in which Lavrov used the repression action of Spain against government leaders somehow as a tool to counter Borrell's accusations of human rights violations concerning the detention of Alexei Navalny. And the fact is that since that moment, not only Lavrov, but also all the Russian officials, especially from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, have been publicly mentioning the EU double standards on Catalonia in several occasions. In this sense, according to your perspective, to the extent that this is becoming a recurring theme in the EU-Russia geopolitical confrontation that is going on, what opportunities, if any, do you see for Catalonia in this regard?
Well, I do think that it's very disconcerting and disappointing that within the EU there is not more of a principled position on this. The EU has a great opportunity to have shown itself in a mediating role, shall we say, as opposed to taking one side, even if it's a formal member's side. And of course it sends the wrong signal to the detractors of the EU and of democracy. Because that example is then used not just by Moscow, but by Beijing, by Ankara, to say, well, those that wave their finger at us, look at what they do in their own home. So I think the problem here is that there is a need for the general public beyond Catalonia and even Spain to know about these things, because I don't think that the message gets out very clearly. People are not aware of that these things are happening and what their implications are. How you address this, creating an institute, but through the media, through more effective, more intensive work on the internet and blogging and etc. It's very important because people don't know about this. I mentioned Belarus. How many people know about this? How many people know that almost every day Ukrainian soldiers are being shot? That conflict by the Russian forces who say they're not there. Who knows about this? It's a war that's forgotten. And there's so many things happening in Europe. But what is important is things that are happening in the heart of Europe, in the heart of the institutions of democracy. These should be better known, these issues and problems and challenges. Therefore, I think it's very important to get that message out, get it across, not just know amongst yourselves and feel bitter about it, but to really engage, as you probably do with the human rights, international human rights organizations, but also lobbying European institutions however possible, and showing what damage is done.
It is possible that actually the fact that these authoritarian states are using, let's say, the Catalan case to throw it against the EU might somehow increase the pressure on the EU to change the stance on Catalonia, especially when it comes to Spain's repressive actions. Still, it's not enough. It's clear. We've seen it. We know it. But there's general perception, certain perception that this somehow is positive because it kind of helped us make our case known more, abroad, not only within the EU but also internationally overseas. And
I would ask you, for example, not you personally, but those deputies who voted in the European Parliament to remove immunity, in their countries and in their constituencies, do their voters and supporters know about the actions they took and what has represented? I mean, if you have colleagues or if you have people living in those countries, they should be writing to them and writing to the press and say, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so voted to... otherwise, it's impunity, They voted, they go home, etc. But these have very significant implications. So even by channeling, by harnessing the national or international human rights organizations, civil rights organizations, that I think that the follow-up is important because, you may publish this in your local newspapers, right? But it doesn't get out it very seldom gets out into the major newspapers of the world. Most people have not heard about this and would be very shocked to learn about this.
Yeah, that's indeed very interesting food for thought. And actually, the last question I wanted to ask you is specifically about, you've mentioned some, but maybe other suggestions or recommendations that you could think of for the Catalan people and its institutions when it comes precisely to the internationalization of the Catalan cause, especially in terms of strategy and potential partners. When talking about partners, you mean obviously also states, both within the EU but also overseas.
Well, the first point, I think you have to be diplomatic and you cannot present yourselves as perhaps your critics try to present you as extremists. You have to make sure that the message is clear. What is it about? Why do you feel that you have a legal, historical, etc., right to the position that you are asserting? That is very important because it's so easy in this age of fake news and distortion to label extremists. Yeah. I mean, for example, when I was in Kiev recently writing on something, the same thing happens as happened here. When some right-wingers, far-right wingers come out and hurl a Molotov cocktail or something in Kiev, in the West there's usually, ultra-righters on the march in Kiev again, extremists. In fact, 100 people came out or so, and they get nothing in terms of the votes. But here, if you get the majority of the votes, you're not extremist, you're absolutely in line with democratic principles, and yet the outside world knows very little about it. So projection of the message and that your respectability, your right to that. Secondly, I think you've got to be aware of the realpolitik. You've seen the EU stance, so you have to. It's not going to change overnight. It's a strategy that needs chipping away through representatives of other countries, lobbying them, which I'm sure is happening. Obviously, the pandemic is not helping because that's paralyzing a lot of social and political activity. But I think what you have to watch is clearly what will happen in Scotland. Because, okay, Britain is out of the EU, but Scotland is about to, the Scottish leaders are trying to revive the idea of referendum on independence. They have elections in May, and their leader has said that if they get a majority in the Scottish Parliament, they will go again for a referendum. So that could pave the way in this, because it seems that even though London is very much against the referendum, they allow the referendum to go forward in 2014, and that could create some headwind for you if you make the right strategy, alliances, because I'm sure there will be people, interested in how that will develop. But just avoid getting yourself a bad press by falling in with the wrong people, and keep banging away on these legal and human rights issues, and calling for the release of political prisoners in Europe. I mean, we have them in Belarus, but to have them in Spain is a bit of an anomaly, to say the least. I hope I'm being diplomatic, and therefore, but for the longer term, somebody who has to really, you need an icebreaker, and at the moment, the only icebreaker I see in Europe potentially is Scotland, if they were to have this referendum this year or next year. Because that would reopen the whole debate in Europe about the rights of nations and self-determination. Because otherwise I feel at the moment, unfortunately, you are rather sidelined and abandoned, to be frank. And you need to build alliances and support. But also to bring support for the idea of dialogue, ongoing dialogue. I mean, it shouldn't be just a standoff. I mean, it should be ongoing dialogue with constructive dialogue with Madrid.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Things that you can only engage in dialogue with someone that wants to talk with you, which is not the case. Or at least not to talk about the issues that could certainly solve the questions such as self-determination. It is indeed a very interesting situation, what's going on in Scotland. We'll be following the case, not only when it comes to prospects of Scotland for independence, but also when it comes to the role of UK as a new, very independent actor, with a new geopolitical perspective, very closer to the principles of realpolitik. It's interesting to have a look at the defense budget and also to the decisions they are taking on nuclear weapons, which are not very. It's something that we'll be definitely following during the next months and years. And indeed, it's interesting what you mentioned about not to be associated or trying to move away from any association from, like, let's say, radical or extremist perceptions, which is something that the Spanish mainstream media and several political sectors are insistently, consistently during the last years trying to associate the Catalan independence movement, the Catalan cause for self-determination, with far right, with let's say the kind of nationalism which is not precisely inclusive. There are several kinds of nationalism. So with let's say the far right. So having said this, thank you very much for this very interesting points you've raised on your answers. Now we'll be moving to questions and answers. We'll be opening the room we have something like 20 minutes more or less for questions and answers from the public. So we will kindly ask you to do your questions in English if it's possible. So Bohdan can understand as well, and if not, Karen will be translating it. So,
just a thought before we go on. I mean, off the top of my head, as a historian, if you were to think in terms of your strategy, taking several stages, and independence not coming overnight, but that it's going to take time, and as an interim, you would want a restoration of some sort of formal autonomy specified in a document, in the constitution or whatever. I mean, let's think of countries where this has become possible and it's become the solution, but you're thinking along other lines. But for example, I look at Germany. Have you tried to tap into Bayern Freistaat? Maybe they're deputies, they're a part of Germany, but they're very proud that they are called a free state, right? I'm not saying that that's a solution. I'm saying as one option of getting some MPs to support you around the idea of restore what you promised us after Franco died and took away from us. At least that is a starting point for further negotiations. I think you have to be creative. Think outside of the box. Don't feel victimized to the extent that you cannot come up with fresh thinking. Try to come up with ideas that are going to engage those who are neutrally disposed, or perhaps are not particularly well informed. And look at those. Look at Czechoslovakia. How did that split? How did that revolution come about without bloodshed? Czechoslovakia. Would those peoples be willing to give some hints and show some sympathy? I mean, I would look at these areas where history has already made things possible or provided interim solutions.
That's correct. Sounds interesting. So we'll be moving now to the first question.
Yes, there is. So apart from the obvious media lack that we have, addressing the public generally apart from governments, I see some possible state possibilities, and one of them is hinted by the coming into the Francophonie of the Catalan Parliament, which has passed from an observing member into a fully member. Do you see any possibility there? Because if we are coming into a world that is less global, less secure, more local and regional, the destiny of Catalonia, it will be more in the hands of their closest powers. And since we are sandwiched between Spain and Catalonia, any possible independence would need the acquiescence, at least, of France.
Well, certainly you have Catalans on the other side of the border too, so obviously you should try to secure at least the understanding, if not the goodwill, or at least the benevolent neutrality of France, which calls for diplomacy, lobbying, contacts at all levels, etc. I don't know. I'm not an expert enough to go into that in any detail. But I look from my British upbringing, and I mean, I've just seen this film with my wife about Ireland and 1916 about Michael Collins. I mean, it seemed impossible. Yeah, there was a war going on. They were killing each other. There was extremism, terrorism, whatever. But it seemed for a few years that Ireland would never get its independence. And yet somehow London was persuaded at the end of the day, first with home rule and then full independence. Sometimes things that you least expect happen. So, as I said before, you have to keep chipping away, but be creative and constructive in the way that you do it. But I'm not a specialist on this part of the world, so I don't have the answers for you.
Just a very brief comment on this. It is, I think, interesting to have a look at this, let's say, contemporary history of the Hispanic power within, like, let's say, last couple of centuries, and look at two of the weakest moments of Spain's power over the territory of contemporary Spain, let's say, which have been at least two of them. Napoleonic Wars, so that we're talking about early 19th century, and the Spanish Civil War. In both cases, in both occasions, there were attempts, let's say, at the early 19th century, more successfully than during the Civil War, from France to reassert certain influence or political control over the territory of Catalonia, which they perceive as a strategic territory, like south of the Pyrenees, you know. And actually, there were some plans. There's not that much talk about this, not that much information published, but there were some plans by France, not officially, of course. Some officials were working on this very discreetly on a possible intervention while Catalonia was still on the Republican side, a military intervention of French troops on the territory of Catalonia to secure it, to assure that it was not going to fall under Francoist troops, especially considering the threat of Nazism and fascism, considering that France had the Nazis on its east, and on the southern border they had like the fascist threat. So the last thing they wanted was to have also fascist border share with fascism in its southwest in this case. And within this plan, the Basque Country was supposed to be occupied by British troops, actually, and to fall under British influence. So it's definitely important, I think, to change the mentality that we do have about France within the pro-independence movement in general as an enemy, or as something from which they're only negative or bad. Or, I mean, we know the history of France, we know all the things that have done against languages, minorities, etc. But when it comes to geopolitics, Bohdan, you mentioned that it is a fact that ultimately any political solution to the conflict, which will imply the recognition of Catalonia as an independent state, one of the conditions will be that France will be not opposed to this. So at least to abstain from vetoing this option, you know. So I definitely agree that it's a very interesting player.
Excuse me. I know there's someone else waiting for having a question, but before this thought gets lost. In the same way that Slavs have the Cercle kind of mentality, Pan-Slavism, not from the Russian view, but for a more ancient group. Shouldn't we resume the more ancient connection we have with the people of France? Just to explore that particular possibility. So we have a goal, a Frankish connection with them. Our language is very close to Occitan, which is very close to French. We used to be part of the same world. Shouldn't we try to revive this idea within the French establishment, now that the republicanism of France is a bit tired, let's say?
I don't think I'm an expert enough to comment on it. I would simply say that if I was a Frenchman, looking at you, I would say, 19th century, that would have been possible. Why not we could get something out of this for ourselves. But I think you've become so crystallized, having recovered from Francoism as a people, as a nation, and so strong in your identity that I think that they would be a bit afraid of that. What I think is interesting, though, for your average Frenchman, is to emphasize some of the similarities in the language. I mean, until I came here, I didn't realize that Catalan was in many ways closer to French in some ways than to Spanish. Obviously, there's a lot of influences from both sides, but that would be interesting with, working through Alliance Française or whatever like that, and some joint cultural projects as a start. But I think if you were to simply drop that idea without proper preparation, it would frighten away people.
All right. Do you have any more questions?
Well, just a brief comment and question. It has to do also with his comment about the role of France towards Catalonia. I think that France could be more favorable to the independence of Catalonia than Spain, because France does not have the economic dependence of Catalonia that Spain has. So, and I think this is very similar to the difference between, for example, Ukraine or Belarus towards Russia regarding Catalonia towards Spain. And it is that both Ukraine and Belarus, they are poorer than Russia, while Catalonia is richer than Spain. And therefore, Spain is very much dependent on Catalan resources. And that is not the case of France. So in this case, I believe that it's easier for France to let Catalonia be independent, or for Russia to let Ukraine be independent, or for Russia to letting Belarus be independent, or for UK letting Scotland be independent, because these are countries that are richer than these other nations. Well, in the case of Catalonia, it's the contrary. So we need to be aware of this difference of these two situations. It's just a comment.
The situation was the same, was similar in the early part of the 20th century, because Ukraine was the powerhouse, Donbass, coal, iron. Ukraine is the granary of Europe for export. So that was one reason why even the, shall we say, non-Bolshevik socialists, the Mensheviks and others, the SRs, didn't want Ukraine to be lost, because it was the economic engine before oil was discovered or coal was discovered in the Urals or whatever. But times have changed.
Yeah, but nowadays it is different. Actually, I live between St. Petersburg and Barcelona, and we have many Ukrainians who come to Petersburg to work because the economic conditions are better. And actually, for example, Crimea represents an expenditure for the Russian government. It's the country than Barcelona, which is bringing money for the Spanish government. So these are important differences, I believe.
I would like to ask once again about the possible Russian influence in the Catalan case, because, well, despite being able to show some power in this question, in the past, the Russian government, the Kremlin didn't show any real interest in moving the figures, on this desk. So, do you think that right now, after the conflict with Germany, after the Nahaylo case, Nahaylo poisoning, and after the situation became a bit more complicated, after that Borrell-Lavrov conference in Moscow, do you think this is going to be changing now? Do you think Russia is going to be more actively playing the Catalan case among any others in order to weaken the European Union somehow?
I think that it will continue. They will try to be a little bit more careful so as not to be caught. And I think Moscow will be interested in any thing that destabilizes what it sees as European countries, their institutions and democracy, those areas where it sees as potentially easier targets where there is disaffection or there are aspirations that have not been met. Obviously, those are enticing, inviting environments for them to operate in. So I would suspect that for the time being it will be more of the same, though it might not be actually a physical presence. It can be done through misinformation, cyber methods, etc., etc. I think it's very difficult to actually do it openly in any way, because they know that the situation is being monitored and they don't want to be exposed. But I don't know what forces there are here that are potentially, shall we say, sympathetic to being influenced by Moscow. The Madrid authorities named some, said that there are these fringe groups, right, with pro-communist or pro-Moscow tendencies, but again, I'm not an expert, I'm reporting what I've read.
Yeah, so far there have been a lot of accusations by mainstream media in Madrid and even by public officials, Spanish public officials, on this so-called interference, Russian interference on Catalonia, but to date there have been no, until there's no evidence, no material, nothing more than accusations. And so that's even funny. The fact that the story of the 10,000 troops has been a great source of jokes and humor here in Catalonia. But again, I mean, there's certainly more disinformation from the Spanish media on this fake news related to the so-called Russian interference in Catalonia that what actually is, So we also have to struggle against it because we are very well aware that the Spanish authorities are very interested into linking the Catalan cause for self-determination with Russian interests, especially in a historical context, contemporary history, last years, where relations between Russia and the EU are every time more hostile. So the Spanish authorities like to, constantly be pointing at us as Russian agents or supportive of the Russian agenda. Of course, it's part of their campaign also against us. So we also have to fight it.
I think they will continue to use whoever they can use for their own ends. And if it happens to be the Catalans, they will use the Catalans, and they will use disaffected youth in the street, encourage them to burn and to be more violent than is warranted, perhaps, and etc. And present this as a very serious shortcoming here of the authorities. I think you have to be very wary streetwise. Clearly, disinformation doesn't just work one way. You're quite right, but I think you're better able to judge what sounds reasonable, what is in the realm of the possible, in what you read about what's happening here, and not accept it at face value. So.
Any more questions?
A bit in line with Mr. Blair's question, I think we've started this discussion looking at the future, having China and Russia in more of a secondary role as the power structures of the world shifting. And Mr. Nahaylo has expressed repeatedly that Catalonia as a political actor shouldn't side with anyone that could be interpreted or related to extremism, far right, etc. As maybe it could be more faced as a hypothetical question. Wouldn't it be wise to, of course, if these countries do not respect human rights and are committing human rights violations, it makes this question quite difficult. But wouldn't it be smart or intelligent to look at this situation and try to take advantage of this interest in the coming future? Perhaps not as a way to become independent, but as a way to create bridges with these common powers of the world.
You're suggesting build bridging with Moscow and Beijing?
No, with Catalonia and Moscow, in the sense of taking this maybe small interest and developing it more through diplomatic relationships to become more.
Well, again, you have to be careful in terms of your tactics. If you want to alienate other European powers and communities, then that's a good recipe for it. Secondly, you'll be siding with countries with extremely dubious records. Spain does not recognize the independence of Kosovo, neither does Moscow, surprise. And we forget about Chechnya. Kadyrov's been in power for a long time, but how many tens of thousands of people were killed in order to pacify that country? Crimea had a so-called referendum at gunpoint, different type of referendum from what was attempted here in a peaceful, open manner. It's a minefield, and you have to be careful with where you're treading. If you have groups, if you have a pluralism, a plurality of forces that work together for the common cause, one or two of them might take that approach, to fly kites and sound out. But that's your call, with all the risks involved.
It is indeed a fact that any choice has consequences on the possible choices with other actors. And when it comes to Russia specifically, the room for antagonism on other sides, especially on the West, it's clear and it's evident. But still, it's good to consider all possibilities here, to discuss and to debate about them. And that's why we're here today, and also among other reasons why we have launched this initiative. I don't know if there are more questions.
I would also suggest that, off the top of my head, look eastward, look towards some of the East European countries. They're not the economic powerhouses. But look at countries like Lithuania that have become so committed, in the case of Belarus, say, but who are screaming for human rights values, European values to be restored, to put back at the center of Brussels' agenda. I think potential of alliances can be found not just with the predictable, with those that we are so used to, but look around at some of the players that are emerging that seem to be genuinely concerned about democratic standards and principles being upheld.
Now that you mentioned the case of the Baltic countries, it's a great example of how, let's say, human rights or democratic values are losing ground in contemporary EU. Especially when it comes to, let's say, when it comes to Catalonia, for instance, the role they played during, let's say, since 2016, 17 on Catalonia, it's been interesting to the extent that it does not go according to its founding values and principles. In some of the cases, even like the right to self-determination, I think in the case of the Constitution of Estonia and Latvia, in both constitutions they have inherited the right to self-determination. They very recently, let's say 30 years ago, precisely this year is the 30th anniversary of their independence, claimed this right internationally to actually become independent states. But here we can see how the Spanish authorities have been playing the cards very well. It's after interesting how in 2013, after we organized here the Catalan Way, imitating a bit the Catalan Way that took place in the Baltics, I think it was here in 1989, if I'm not mistaken. So let's say hundreds of thousands, even millions of Catalans went to the street, they changed themselves from north to south. And afterwards, that was for our National Day, September 11th, there were some statements from two prime ministers, Lithuanian prime minister by that time and Latvian prime minister, saying that they respected what was going on in Catalonia and they would be willing to respect the will of the Catalan people in case of a referendum, in case of a vote, in a sense of maybe opening the door to a recognition of independence. Afterwards, conflict between Russia and Ukraine erupted. There was an annexation of Crimea, there was a war in Donbass. There was, let's say, hardening of international relations in Eastern Europe, especially between Central Eastern Europe and Russia. And these three small countries, they became much more concerned about their security and who was there to provide the security with Russia, NATO, and who played a very smart role here in Spain. They deployed troops, they deployed tanks, they have been very active when it comes to air policy of these countries. Since then, they are absolutely aligned with the Spanish position on Catalonia. And this is something that we need to learn about precisely. These lessons, when it comes to the Baltics, what can we offer also as a political project that wants to become an independent state in terms of what concerns the most of its defense and territorial integrity in this case, because it's, they are small states that they feel threatened by an external threat. I'm not talking about internal integrity, but by external threat. So they are precisely very, very interesting cases to learn also in terms of how really currently international relations or the model of international relations it's developing and it's moving to.
They are held hostage by Moscow because after watching what happened in Crimea, the so-called referendum, the Baltic countries, particularly Estonia and Latvia, they have very large Russian minorities. And they panicked. They didn't want to see the same scenarios that, a city is taken over and declares itself independent but wanting to join Russia. So, you're quite right, but it's understandable that they've got cold feet now over this.
So, I don't know if there are more questions. If not, we will be ending the session here. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you especially Bohdan for being today with us. I will give the floor to Rosa.
Primer de tot, agrair al senyor Nahaylo. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your insights and also your journey.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your patience and for the discussion.
Thank you. I sobretot, moltes gràcies a tots vosaltres per ser aquí i també als que ens estat seguint des de casa. Us animem a seguir les activitats del Pintar, les publicacions